And now, from beyond our dimension, this is the JeffMara podcast. Here's Jeff.
My guest is Rob Sullivan, inspirational speaker and trainer whose unexpected life journey weaves together a rich tapestry of paranormal experiences and more. Rob, thanks for joining me and welcome.
Thank you. It's an absolute honor to be on your show.
Well, the honor is all mine, Rob. And if you don't mind, let's start with your very first experience and go from there.
Absolutely. So when I was little, I was into, typical boy, UFO and things like that, reading every book I could get my hands on, even books on the Titanic, which were pretty interesting later in the journey. But later in my 20s, I got interested in the near-death experience things. And I remember reading these books and thinking, oh, I would love to have an experience like that. Not that I wanted to die, I certainly didn't, but I was interested in just the whole idea of, having a real physical sort of experience of that. And there's that part of me that thought, okay, well, that's never going to happen, but, nice thinking. So I just read all the books and whatnot. Well, at the time, I was volunteering at the Children's Hospital in Chicago, and I had ended up doing that for 34 years. And there was a little girl there who I met when she was a couple months old, and she was in the intensive care unit. And this little girl, I'm going to call her Annabelle. That was not her real name. Obviously, we have to protect the confidentialities. But she was this little girl, and she couldn't be held. She had brittle bones and whatnot, but she had this amazing energy about her. Just like she lit up the room. Everybody loved her. And so every week for a year, I went in to see her and I played with her and, as much as we could. And we just always had an amazing time. Even though we couldn't talk necessarily because she was a couple months old, just the smile on her face and just the interactions we would have. Well, fast forward a year later, the doctors had a meeting with her family and they said, we're not going to be able to do anything more for her and it would be better if she died at home. And of course, everybody at the hospital who knew her loved her. And we were all devastated knowing that we were never going to see Annabelle again. And so, she left and we were sad and grieving. Well, 3 weeks later, it was a beautiful Saturday afternoon. It was about 3:00. I'm walking toward the beach in Chicago. And all of a sudden, I just got this feeling, and I get a chill every time I think of it. I just got this incredible feeling like I was being surrounded by just the biggest hug ever, just this loving energy. And I looked at my watch, it was 3:00, and I thought, she just died. I know, and I had, I was not very spiritually in tune necessarily at that point in my life. It would be interesting if it happened now, if I would be aware of more of what was going on. But the overall impression I had in that moment was that she had come to say goodbye and that she was basically just saying, thank you for being my friend. And I was so touched because I do believe that, we're here for a reason. And I do believe that people, can do that, and I guess one of the big things for me is I feel like, she was a teacher for me because at the time I used to think I was confused, from a spiritual standpoint, because I had always been raised to believe that, God is love. And having been raised Catholic, I believed that I didn't really believe in reincarnation necessarily at the time, because that wasn't really something that the church taught. And, so this idea that, God is love and you only get one chance, I couldn't really reconcile that because how could that be the case that you'd only get, that there were these kids that I was meeting at the hospital who would live a few days, a few months, a year and a half in her case. And how could that be their only chance? It just didn't make sense to me. But the fact that, and I came to realize later that I, in fact, do accept the idea of reincarnation. And I think that in some cases, she wasn't here for herself. I believe that she was here for others. I think she was here as a teacher, probably for her family, certainly for some of the medical staff. And I'm not egocentric enough to think that she had been sent here for me, but I was a beneficiary of the work that she was doing. And the fact that she stopped on her way out to say, hey, thanks for being my friend. It was unbelievable. And it was really, truly the first experience I ever had like that. And it was fast forward to the following Thursday when I got to the hospital, my supervisor, Jamie, looked at me and she said, we got some sad news this week. And I said, yeah, Annabelle died, didn't she? And she looked at me and she said, and I said, it was Saturday around 3:00. And she's like, how did you know that? I was like, I just knew, she came to say goodbye.
What were your religious beliefs at the time, and did this make any change within them?
It did. I was still a bit struggling with the whole idea of, I still accepted, Catholicism. And I was even playing guitar in church and doing stuff like that. I was there largely my passion for music, more so, I'm embarrassed to say, than just my dedication to the religion itself. And I do believe in a lot of the, Christian type beliefs, but I don't accept the idea that this is our one and only shot. And that was a pivotal moment for me, because I realized that it wasn't her one and only shot. It couldn't have been, because that wouldn't be something a loving God would do, in my opinion. And I don't believe, I'm not trying to change anybody's belief. These are just things that I've come to view differently. And so that was a bit of a turning point for me, working with the kids at the hospital, because I did start to realize that they were having a different experience. It's not like those of us who go through an entire life and live 70, 80, 90 years and have the opportunity to make tons of mistakes and learn and grow. That's clearly not what was happening for people who were only living a few days, weeks, or months. And so it forced me to really think about what is going on here. And then later, in fact, when I first heard about reincarnation, I remember it was a George Harrison song, where the lyrics are along the lines of "Give me love, give me life, keep me free from birth." And I remember asking probably my parents, and like, what does that mean? And that was when I first learned about, like, for example, the caste system and stuff. And my idea at the time was, oh, that doesn't sound very good. I don't like the idea of working my way up from, lower levels to higher levels. It sounds challenging. And it was only later that I began to look back at the whole reincarnation thing and think, you know what, I think there's truth to it. And then later, through some different, things that I didn't really expect, I had a number of encounters with intuitives and different people who had clued me in on some past life stuff that I hadn't even asked about, that I was able to, in some cases, confirm, not necessarily in the way that, an investigator might confirm, but things that were enough of a confirmation for me that made me think, you know what, I've been here before.
Did Annabelle ever visit you in a dream later?
No, she didn't. I would have loved it. She just had this, she lit up the room. I mean, her smile, like, you would notice it even if you weren't looking at her. She just had that energy about her. And that was one, I realized that there was a lot more to her. But that was, no, that was the one and only time that happened. There were other people who died who did show up in dreams, but she was not one of them. I would have loved it.
Hmm.
She's welcome anytime.
Well, wasn't your life saved by a dream or something?
Yeah, that was fast forward to just a couple of years ago. I'll never forget this. I woke up, and I've always kept track of my dreams to greater or lesser extents. But this was a dream that I'll never forget. I can picture it vividly. I was standing on the shore of an ocean, and the water was just, incredibly rough. The skies were dark, but it was as if the storm had passed. But there was a lifeguard next to me, and he communicated in the dream telepathically, which got my attention immediately, because that's not, usually that doesn't happen. That only happened one other time in a dream. And so he communicates telepathically that he said, don't be fooled by the relative calm. It's going to get worse before it gets better. And then he turned around, he started running at top speed away from the water. And I thought, well, if the lifeguards are running away from the water at top speed, I better do the same thing. So I start running. And I catch up to him. And when I catch up to him, there is a 40 or like 40 or 50-foot wall to my left. And it's these huge cinder blocks all stacked up on top of each other. And by the time I got to the wall, this huge wave crashes into the wall. And I could see, because I was even with the wall, I could see the water coming out the other side. And I can picture the seaweed and the plants that were coming through with the water. And the wall blocked about 90% of the water. I looked up and I could see that there was also water in the distance. So I was obviously on some sort of a peninsula. And I woke up immediately and I thought, wow, that was really striking. I don't know exactly what happened. So, but I remembered the dream and I thought that's an important dream. I go to the gym And after the gym, I noticed that my collarbone was bugging me a bit. I thought I had pulled a muscle or whatever. So I spent a lot of the day and a lot of the morning just kind of massaging it and whatnot. I had an appointment with a doctor that morning to get a shot in my ankle, a cortisone injection. And I asked him, I said, if my ankle is bone on bone, and the bone on bone is literally at the ankle, I said, why is the pain 3 or 4 inches up my leg? And he looked at me and he said, oh, that's referral pain. And I thought, okay, that's interesting. My next appointment was an endodontist. My dentist had sent me because he was afraid a tooth was cracked. And the endodontist, as he was taking this 360 x-ray, says, does this tooth on top, he said, do you ever get sensitivity to hot and cold? And I said, not that tooth, but the one immediately below it, that happens quite a bit. And he looked at me and he said, oh, that's referral pain. He said, it's the same, it is that tooth. I thought, why am I hearing about referral pain twice in one day? And referral pain, for people who don't know what that is, it's I had it another time where I got a shot in my arm and they hit a nerve and it didn't hurt in my elbow, where they gave me the shot. It hurt in my finger and my hand. It's where the pain is in a different place. And so I'm thinking, why am I hearing about referral pain? So fast forward around lunch, early afternoon, the collarbone thing wasn't bugging me at all. So I thought, I had forgotten about it more or less. I had an appointment in the afternoon, and then I was on my way to go get dinner. It was around 6 o'clock. I'm walking up Grand Avenue in Chicago, and I get to the corner of Ogden and Grand, and this comes back, this weird feeling in my collarbone, which was not, it wasn't pain. It was just, like I said, I thought I had pulled a muscle working out. And because of the dream popped back into my head immediately. And I thought, here's, this, it's going to be calm and then it's going to come back. I thought, well, that's exactly what happened with this. And I'm like, is this related to the dream? So I stopped on the corner. It sounds dramatic, but this is exactly what happened. I looked up and quietly asked, I said, do I need to get this checked or can I go get shrimp tacos? And that was my exact question because I was on my way for shrimp tacos. And the answer came back immediately. You need to get that checked. So I immediately dial up an Uber, go to the nearest urgent care. They hooked me up to a bunch of monitors, and the woman looked at me and she said, you are having a heart attack. She said, your heart's not getting enough oxygen. And when I got to the main hospital, they said the artery on the left wall of my heart was 90% blocked, which is exactly like the dream. The wall on the left was blocking 90% of the wave that hit it. And it was interesting, and so the cardiologist brought like literally about 14 medical students in to hear my story. They were so blown away because they were like, here's somebody, at the time I was 54 in really good shape. I've always worked out. They couldn't believe it. At one point, somebody looked at me and they were like, he even has stomach muscles. He's like, he's not a category. He's not somebody you would think of as, somebody who would be having a heart attack. And I found out later from a roommate in college who's an emergency room physician. He said, Rob, he said, you had the widowmaker. He said, that artery, he said, if that had turned into a full-blown heart attack, he said, you'd be gone. And so my life was literally saved by that dream. When I look back on it, I consider myself so fortunate because what was happening here was nothing. I mean, literally, anything that you've done last time you can think of having hurt yourself, I promise you, was at least 10 times more painful than this. And I absolutely would not have paid attention to it at all had I not had the dream. There was nothing about it that sounded, that was warning or ominous, that seemed ominous. It was just something that was, it was like a little cramp of some sort.
And that was probably because you were in such good shape.
Possibly. Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting because, there is a sense that I've been, I'm fairly in tune with my body in some respects like that. So I do notice things that, later on I did end up going through lymphoma, which I'm not going to get into too much because there wasn't a real big spiritual connection with that. But I remember my dad saying that he thought it was interesting that the biggest tumor, there was a 5 by 7 by 8 centimeter tumor that was sitting on my heart, that I had a sense that there was something going on. And he said he had patients who had tumors much larger than that who never felt a thing. And he said the fact that I had a sense that there was something that wasn't right was amazing.
Do you lucid dream, or have you had any other type of special dreams like that?
The most amazing dream that I've ever had followed a session that I had had with a woman in Chicago she does these intuitive readings. It's kind of hard to describe because it's not a typical psychic thing. And I had gone to her because I had been struggling a bit in my business. I really felt like I was spinning my wheels. And I wanted to get a sense of, is there a past life connection? Is there something I need to heal here? And she started looking into my background. It was really fascinating to watch her work because she would, snap her fingers and blow and do these different things. And as she was moving energy around and picking things up, and she said, at one point, she looked at me and she said, "You have an elaborate system of stuffing your feelings." She said, "It's really beautiful, but I don't get that it's working for you anymore." And I said, "Really?" And she said, "Can I, do I have your permission to look in and figure out where it's coming from?" And I said, "Absolutely. Anything. I'm open." And so she starts going into it, and she's got her eyes shut, and she's like, "Oh," and she kind of does a few more things, and she's like, "Oh." And she's doing this again, and then she's like, "Oh," and I'm like, "What?" I'm on the edge of my seat. I'm going like, "What are you seeing?" And she said, "You had a lifetime in a regime that was, it was a very fascist kind of regime." And she said, "You were a soldier." And she said, "You did not want to be a soldier." And she said, "But you knew that your family expected that, your country expected that, and you didn't really have any other options." So she said, "You joined and became a soldier." And she said, "Your whole thing at the time was, in that lifetime," she said, "you basically said, I'm going to do what I'm told to do. I'm going to follow orders, and that's it." She said, "Your problem was that you did a really good job following orders, and you got progressively more, uh, you got a lot of promotions, and you were progressively more responsible for the things that were happening because you were in a higher level, and you were then making some of those decisions." She said, "Again, you were still following orders, but," she said, "when you looked back on that lifetime, you said, 'I'm never doing that again.'" And she said, "Not only that, but," she said, "you made a vow." Or she said, "You got to look and see if it's a vow or an agreement." But she said, "You determined in that moment that you would never do that again, and that you would spend the rest of your lifetimes in service of humanity." And I thought to myself, now she didn't know anything about my business not struggling. Oh, and she said, "with no expectation of reward." And I thought, well, that would certainly explain it. And then so she goes into this whole thing, and she said, "We need to figure out if it's a vow or an agreement." And I loved working with her because she wasn't like one of those charlatans where she's like, "Oh, well, you got to buy these candles and you got to come back 3 times." She's like, "Let's clear it out right now. We'll figure it out." Turned out it was a vow. We went through this little 10-minute sort of ceremony to uncover it, where I had to do the work. I basically had to visualize, letting that go and whatnot. And so we did that, felt okay. A week later, I had this dream, and I had just gone to bed. I was sitting down. It was one of those nights that I was debating whether or not I was going to go out, and I was hoping that my friend who I was going to go out with was not going to come over. So around 10 o'clock, I shut there's a French door, to the patio, and I shut that, and I went upstairs, and I went to bed. And then I woke up at 10 minutes after 12, which from a numerology standpoint is significant too, I'm told, in terms of endings and new beginnings. But what happened was, when I woke up, I had had this dream, but it wasn't a dream. Usually when I dream about my house, it's not really my house. It looks a little different, and this was not only my house, but I was aware that it was the exact same night. And I was literally back to sitting on the sofa before I'd made the decision to go to bed. And in that moment, where I had been brought back to, the doorbell rang, and it was raining outside, and so there was this urgency, like I had to get down, and I go down, and it was wild because what happened, this being comes up, and when I opened the door, there was like this guy in a trench coat, and the next thing I know, I'm in my living room, and again, it's my house, there's nothing different about it. He's on the far end of the living room, and I'm standing at the top of the stairs with the kitchen in my back, and he looks at me, and telepathically, this was the other telepathy thing. He communicates, he said, "I am that part of you responsible for stuffing your feelings. You can't let me go." And of course, I'm shocked, and I'm thinking about all of everything I know about affirmation and whatnot. And I thought, all right, you got to do some dancing here, Rob. But I looked at him and I said, "Thank you." I said, "I really appreciate you." I said, "You were there at a very difficult time in my life. It turned out it was the earlier life. I said, you were there at a very difficult time in my life. And I appreciate that. I said, I don't need you anymore, though. It's time for you to go. And I turned around and made it really clear that he needed to leave. And so I got back downstairs, I opened the door, and then the next thing I know, he's right outside the door, and this little dog leads him away. And when I told that story to Therese Rowley, the woman who had done the reading for me the week before, uh, there was another woman listening, and I said, I'm clear about just about everything that happened in that dream, because it wasn't really a dream, it was more like a vision. I said, the only thing I didn't really understand was the dog. And she said, yeah, I'm not sure about that either. At that point, this woman who had asked if she could hear my story chimed in. She said, I know what that is. And we looked at her, we're like, what are you talking about? She said, well, when you wouldn't host this being anymore, it needed to be led away by something. And a dog represents unconditional love. So that's what came to lead it away. And I just got a chill even telling you that. And it was, and Teresa and I looked at each other and she, you know what? She's exactly right. That feels right. The amazing thing is my business started to take off after all that, after I let that go. Now, I would love to look at you and say, oh, here are the 3 things that I did to turn things around and look at what a brilliant business person I am. I know that none of that's true because I didn't do anything different, but I did begin to get traction after that. And I do connect it with that whole idea of that I needed to let go of that past life issue.
Well, after having so many signs and synchronicities in your life, is it difficult to follow your own inner compass?
Yes, it can be. And it's interesting because even then in those moments, that's when I realized that I need to let go. And so give you an example. And interestingly, there's well, it's a prayer connection more so than a dream. But I had an issue with a friend, and he was a musician in Chicago, really well-known guy, and he and I had become friends, and I was very excited because he wanted me to play guitar on his next album, and I'm not a very good guitarist, so the fact that he was teaching me and doing all this stuff, I thought, wow, this is really cool. I'm not going to mention his name because it's not really important in the context of the story, but what happened was he and I used to talk a couple times a week, and then all of a sudden he stopped calling. And I was really confused. And I know that I had heard that he'd started dating a woman that I had been dating a few months before that. So I called her up and I said, I know he's got a big birthday coming up and I don't want to forget it, but I haven't heard from him. And she paused and she said, you're not going to hear from him either. And I'm like, what do you mean? I'm confused. She said, because you lied to him. I said, lied to him about what? And she said, about us. And I said, I'm really confused. I said, he asked me if we had ever dated, or he asked me if we were dating. And I said that we weren't. And I encouraged him to ask you out because I knew that he was interested. And she said, no, he asked you if we had ever dated, and that you denied that we had ever dated. I said, that actually isn't what happened. But I said, it takes 2 to miscommunicate. I can own that. And, so I called him up and I said, I left him, he didn't pick up, of course, but I left a message and I said, I'm really sorry. It appears we miscommunicated. I didn't hear the question correctly. Did we date? Yes, absolutely. Oh, and I had asked her, I said, by the way, why does this matter? I said, you guys are going out and I thought everything was fine. And she said, well, he has this little rule that he won't date anybody that any of his friends have ever dated. I'm thinking to myself, what are we, 11? But I let that go. And so I, called him up. I left that message and I never heard from him. And I knew that I wasn't going to, but the problem was, to your point, I started getting sick. I couldn't, even though I know that, there's, how important forgiveness is and things like that, it doesn't always happen. And so as I got progressively more sick, the glands on my neck started swelling. I had a fever. By Saturday night that week, I was on the sofa, in my basement, calling my dad, asking for his, medical advice, because obviously he's a doc. And he said, oh, when I told him the symptoms, he said, you've got the really bad flu that's going around. I said, well, what can I do? He said, nothing, it's a virus. I said, well, how long is it going to last? He said, my patients have had it for 2 weeks. I said, but I've got an out of town gig on Wednesday. He said, you better find somebody else because you will not be there. And he said, just go to bed. So I go to bed and I prayed. Because when you get to those points, the only thing you can do is let go and give up and pray or whatever. So I got to or that's one of the things you can do, certainly. So I got up and I remember I was delirious from the fever and I prayed. I said, God, I need your help. I said, I know that the congestion and everything that I'm feeling are the words trapped. But I also know that the conversation that I most need to have is never going to happen, not because I don't want it to happen, but because it's just not going to happen. And sure enough, it did not happen. The guy even later died, and he and I had never talked after that. It just wasn't going to happen. I said, God, I need help letting go of this. And in that moment, I saw a hologram in front of me, and that hologram it was the Da Vinci, I don't know what it's called, but it's the circle image with the guy with his arms and legs out. It's like a medical thing. And in that image was my friend. And he was a big guy. He's about 6'5", probably 300 pounds. And in that image, superimposed on the front of mine, is my little nephew. And my nephew at the time is 3 years old, and Steele, who was 3 at the time, and he's taking up the exact same space as this friend who's 47 years old and 270 pounds heavier. And I'm thinking, and I laughed out loud. I said, God, that's a really interesting image, but I don't get it. And then that was one of the only times I've ever heard a voice. And the voice said, and I'll never forget, it wasn't a male voice or a female voice, it was just a voice. And it said, the exact words were, he is at the emotional development level of a 3-year-old. It is not his fault. Be more compassionate. And in an instant, I got it. I was like, oh, I wouldn't be mad at a 3-year-old for misunderstanding. It's not right for me to be upset with somebody who's much older chronologically if they're at the same developmental level. It's just, there's no judgment there. It's just, that's what is. And it made perfect sense to me. It was the absolute most beautiful image to communicate that to me. I let it go. I woke up twice that night, so drenched with sweat that I had to change clothes. When I woke up in the morning, it was completely healed. And it was all from the letting go and from the prayer that was answered, which was amazing to me because, again, I had never heard a voice before. And the fact that, that I could pray in that moment of need where I'm just struggling and angry and suffering over something and get such a quick response was mind-blowing.
Your book is called A Trek Within, and in that book, you write about other people who have had spiritual or otherworldly experiences. What are some of your favorites?
Oh, so many. There's, the typical sort of ones that people shared where, like my friend Kathleen from high school, she pulled up to an intersection with friends in the back seat, and even though the light was green, she stopped because I think she'd smelled her grandmother's perfume, or something reminded her of her dead grandmother. And her friends were like, Kathleen, it's green, go. And she didn't know why she stopped, but she stopped. And just at that moment, a car went right through the red light at 70 miles an hour that would have T-boned them and killed them all. So, I mean, and we've all heard stories like that. So that was pretty cool. But the thing that really caught me by surprise is, a lot of people shared stories, but the stories that were the most amazing to me were the vanishing twin stories. Now, this was something I wasn't even aware of that could happen. And the first one that I had heard about was my friend Marjorie. And she'd heard me talk about the book, and she looked at me and she said, I have a story for you. And she was one of the people who was great. She was very willing to share a story, but she didn't want her name in there because she's from a small town in France. And she said it just could be uncomfortable. So, she's an example of somebody, she had nothing to gain by sharing it, but she wanted me to know what happened. She'd been a little girl in France, and when she was in kindergarten, they did a tapestry as a class. And in the tapestry, all the kids had done a self-portrait that they put then into these, they wove them together into these art projects. And then years later, she was looking at the art project and she was trying to figure out where her friend Mathilde was. Because, when she was in kindergarten, she remembered Mathilde, who was always there with her. She was often in her dreams. And it was just somebody that, she considered her best friend at the time. And she asked her mother, she said, where's Mathilde? And the mother looked at her and she said, there is no Mathilde. There was no Mathilde in your class. And she said, yes, there was. She went and got the class picture and she pointed out to the little girl and she said, that's Mathilde. And Marjorie said, mother looked at her and she said, no, Marjorie, that's you. And in that moment, Marjorie realized what happened. Her mother had told her later, when Marjorie was a teenager, that her mother had been pregnant with twins. And her mother had fallen and she knew something bad had happened. And she went to the hospital and she found out that one of the twins had died when she fell. And the original plan was to name the twins Stephanie and Mathilde. But when they, when there was only one, she and her husband changed their mind and decided to name the remaining twin Marjorie. And so that was the moment that Marjorie really put it all together and realized that this best friend who was often in her dreams, up until she was about 7 years old, was actually her twin who had died before she was born, which was amazing. And when I shared that story later with my friend Richard, who is somebody that I grew up with, his wife shared her own version of that. And two of the stories in the book are what the one from Richard's wife and one from Richard's daughter, and they both shared the vanishing twin story from their own point of view. And it was wild because the little girl, who's not so little now, she's probably, I think she's around 20, but when she was a baby, Megan, her mother, said she always, she would laugh in her sleep. And she just was just this very happy little girl. And she said later, her name's Haley. Haley said she's never had a dream that her twin was not in. She knew all along that she had a twin. And one day she asked her twin in a dream, she said, how come, we have so much fun together? How come we are not, how come you're not on Earth? Why did you leave, basically? And then with a twin didn't say anything, but she showed her graphically like the image of the two of them in a wheelchair in front of the classroom. And Haley couldn't move and she couldn't talk and she was very developmentally challenged, which incidentally is what the doctors had told Megan they were worried about if she carried the twins to term. And so her sister had communicated, in this dream, what would have happened, what life it would have been like if she had stayed. And it was really an act of love on her sister's part to leave so that Haley could have a normal life. And then Megan, when she told this story about it, it had started for her, interestingly, as a prayer because she got pregnant. Haley was her second child. And she got pregnant so easily. And she had three friends who couldn't get pregnant. They were having the hardest time. And one night she prayed, she said, God, please take this baby from me and give it to my friends. She said, I get pregnant so easily and they're all struggling. And amazingly, later, she had a memory of the baby leaving. And she said, she described it like a comet, you just coming right out of her womb and just shooting off. And she said, in that moment, she's like, if that's the moment you left us, thank you. And when she went to the hospital for the next ultrasound, she was the only one in the room who wasn't surprised when they're looking at it and saying, there's only one baby now, where there used to be two. And interestingly, all three of her friends got pregnant, and those three, they all had girls, and those four girls, Haley and the three other girls, are now best friends and have been ever since they were little kids.
Rob, after reading your book, what is the biggest takeaway that someone should get?
The biggest takeaway that somebody should get is that the world is open to them in terms of synchronicities, dreams, and all the different paranormal or supernatural things, whatever you want to call it. The people who have these experiences, you may hear them and think, oh, I wish that happened to me. It really could happen to you. And it's a matter of taking the time to practice, like a muscle. If you're learning to play the piano, you're not going to play Beethoven's Grand Sonata Pathétique the first time you hear the music unless you're exceptionally gifted. It's going to take practice and you're going to need to do that. Well, the same thing is true for a lot of the spiritual things we're talking about. Like, I strongly recommend keeping a dream journal as one thing that people can do as a way, and even for people who say they don't dream or they don't remember, well, this is a way to do it. Just even if you just have a flash of an image or a song going through your mind, get up and write it down. Whether it's in a journal or whether it's in a memo on your phone, doesn't really matter, but just the more you do it, the more you'll be able to do it. When a synchronicity happens where the phone rings and you know who it is, keep track of that. Be grateful for that. Gratitude is a really big thing here. I also have people, because at the end of each chapter, I have a little thing called Making It Real. And one of the suggestions in there is about keeping a gratitude journal and being grateful in advance for the wonderful things that are happening. Because gratitude it's amazing. It has a way of just, it's the law of attraction. You get whatever you give attention, energy, and focus to. And if you're giving attention, energy, and focus to, here are the wonderful things that are happening in my life. Even if you don't, you might have 95% of your life might be not wonderful and you might be super frustrated. But if you look for that, 5% and you focus on that 5%, you can expand that to 7, 10, 20 with conscious effort by giving attention, energy, and focus to the things that you want to be most grateful for. So dreams, synchronicities, same thing with meditation. I gave a couple of ideas for different things because I was never one to be able to meditate. The idea of shut your mind off, I mean, you lost me right there. But there are a couple of meditations that I found that are really beautiful and amazing and have been incredible in terms of the things that you can even do with other people, which is amazing. I would never have thought that was possible with meditation. So, being open, that's really the short version, be open and practice.
Were those meditations guided?
One of them started out that way. I went to a wilderness survival school in New Jersey, a guy named Tom Brown Jr., who sadly died about a month ago. He was somebody who he learned from a Lipan Apache who had never lived in civilization. And this is a pretty wild story, just from the beginning. The Indian that he learned from was a guy named Stalking Wolf. They also called him Grandfather. And when Grandfather was a child, he had a vision of an 11-year-old white boy collecting fossils by the river. And he had never even seen a white person because he was born in the late 1800s. And so years later, he sees Tom by the river collecting fossils, and he remembered what the elders had told him at the time. Was they said, "When you see that boy, you will know what to do." And he did know what to do. He spent 10 years teaching Tom about the ways of Native Americans, being a shaman, being a scout, the edible and medicinal plants. And so Tom opened this wilderness survival school. And one of the things that he talked about in his book, Awakening Spirits, is something that we did at the school, where he said, what you do is you visualize, from a meditation standpoint, you visualize a beautiful natural surrounding. So it could be any natural surrounding. So, I mean, it could be the surface of the moon, it could be a beach, it could be a mountaintop, as long as it's not something man-made, like, say, a roller coaster or amusement park thing. And he said, you picture this and you create it so that it's your space. And I love what he said. He said, it's real when it's finished when you can't add anything to it. And it's real when you can bring people there. And it was interesting because years later, I was doing an acting class that it was the spiritual side of acting. And I talked to the teacher ahead of time, my friend David Murphy, and I told him about this meditation. I said, do you want to try this with the group and see if we can bring people to, he called it the medicine place. And I said, do you want to see if we can bring people to my medicine place? He's like, yeah, let's do it. And we ended up doing it in 2 different classes. And long story short, people came back from this meditation and they accurately described my healing place, including things that are not necessarily, they're not what people would consider possible. In terms, and I'll just say, one of them, for example, the ability to breathe underwater is something that I thought would be really cool. And so I incorporated that into my vision. And people came back from the meditation and multiple people described how they went swimming and they were surprised to find they could breathe underwater. And I thought, wow, what Tom said is true. I brought people there. They described the surroundings. They described what the animals they were seeing. It was spectacular. And it was something that I would never have thought. What I liked about it, though, especially, is it's an active meditation. It's not, empty your mind, picture clouds blowing by. It's stuff that never worked for me. This was something I could get behind, and it was amazing to realize that it actually does work.
Rob, what's a question that you wish people would ask you, but nobody ever does?
Wow. I got to think about that. The question that I wish people would ask me, and I share this, but no one ever asks it. I usually just volunteer it, is what's the biggest mistake you've ever made and how did you learn from it? And the biggest mistake I would say is having a scarcity mentality. And for those of you who don't know what I mean by that, a scarcity mentality is where you don't believe there's enough of something. And the big 3 are love, money, and time. And for me, the scarcity mentality was around money. Excuse me. I was objectively cheap, and I'm not proud to say that. It's embarrassing to think back on it. And I had an old girlfriend named Amber, and after we had broken up, she was an angel in my life. She called me up about 6 months after we broke up, and she said, "Rob, I have some feedback for you that I really think is going to help you in future relationships, but I don't have time to talk about it right now. Are you going to be around later?" And I thought, wow. So we agreed to meet 4 hours later, and I'm human. I spent the first 3 of those hours, I'm embarrassed to say, doing the equivalent of winning imaginary arguments in the shower. I was defending myself against this, what seemed like an attack. And then finally, it dawned on me. I said, "Wait a minute, Rob. There's nothing in it for her. Neither one of us really wants to get back together. She's giving you a gift of feedback with the hope that it'll help you. Why don't you try being grateful?" And so I did that. I opened up, and welcomed her when she came in, and it shifted, from that defensive place. And she looked at me, and I'll never forget. She said, "Remember that story you told me about your grandfather?" And I said, "Yeah." She was referring to the fact that after he died, we found thank you notes from people we had never met. He had put somebody through college that we have no idea who it was. I mean, he was generous at a level that a lot of people are not generous. And I said, I wanted to be generous at that level. And she looked at me, she said, "You are exactly the opposite." And like a good coach, she went on to give me a specific example after example of times that I had been objectively cheap. Now, I'm not one to make excuses. I'm not going to sit here and say, "Oh, I was drinking. I don't remember doing that." Truth is, I really wasn't. I never was much of a drinker, certainly not at that point in my life. And excuse me. So there was no excuse for it because there were things that I had done that I didn't remember doing. Now, when she gave me the specific examples, I literally didn't, I'm not questioning her. I don't think she made it up. I know she didn't. And then later, when I went back to apologize to other people who would have seen it, they smiled and said, "Oh, yeah, we knew, we just thought were having trouble with money or whatever." And everybody was very gracious about it. And she said, "I broke up with you because I don't believe people can change." Now, I didn't argue with her in that moment because I do believe people can change. And I'm an example of that. In that moment, I got my abundance books out, and I started because I had read the books, I just wasn't living it. And so I realized that I needed to be generous before the money started coming in. And it was around the same time as the dream that I talked about earlier, and I was getting it. Fortunately, I was getting all of this handled largely at the same time, and it was amazing to me how that turned around. So I mean, I literally went from just having massive debt to now I travel a lot, and people look at me and they say, "How do you travel so much? How do you take so much time off?" Um, Amber is the angel that made that possible because I would still be circling the drain financially if I hadn't gotten over that scarcity mentality. And so if you feel like that, if you feel like there's not enough time, there's not enough money, there's not enough love, read some of the books on abundance. There's many, many of them out there. Put it into practice. It is something you can get over, and it's something that it's one of the biggest gifts I've ever received was being called on that. And it's a bit embarrassing because lots of people saw me do it, but she was the only one who had the courage to tell me about it.
What were your limiting beliefs around abundance that you had to get over?
Wow, that's an interesting question. I think some of the bigger ones were just that, I could only be generous after I had the money coming in. So like I would have to, win the lottery and pay off all my debt before I could, help somebody do, something or be generous to somebody else. And that's not true. I mean, and it's interesting to me because some of the most generous people in the world have nothing. I remember I read a book one time. It was written by a cab driver in Chicago named Camille Nasser, and it's called A Cyclist's Adventures on Five Continents, I think is the name of the book. And he talked about riding his bike around the world, literally, and how he would go to these countries where people literally didn't have walls. They might even have, just a thatched roof, and yet they would share their meals with him and they would welcome him to their house. And he said people, the generosity he experienced, the most that he experienced was in the places that were the most impoverished. And they're a wonderful example of the fact that you don't have to have things in order to give them away necessarily. And the more that you give away, the more that you receive. And so when I did become generous and I started giving, even though I continued to work on reducing my debt and things, that's when things turned around. When I put those things into practice and I got rid of that limiting belief that says there isn't enough. There's plenty. there's all kinds of evidence out there. If you look at somebody who's really rich and you're jealous of them, that's not the best strategy. A better way to look at that is to look at somebody and say, wow, look what that person's achieved. If she can do that, I can do that too.
Are there any other limiting beliefs that you overcame that were huge obstacles in your life?
Yeah, I believe very much that we all have a secret excuse. And I'd heard somebody talk about this one time, and I love the idea because it's an excuse that we carry around that says, I'd be successful in this area if it weren't for whatever. And one of my secret excuses was, I'm 5'9". I'm not the tallest guy in the room. I'm also not the shortest guy in the room, but I had a limiting belief for a long time that I wasn't tall enough and that I wouldn't find love or whatever simply because, women were looking for guys who are over 6 feet. It sounds superficial, but it was a limiting belief. And the thing is like, I wasn't owning it. I wasn't owning the gifts that I have. And when people own the gifts that they have, it's amazing what shows up. As an example, one of my teachers in that was somebody, I don't even know what her name was. I was in a bar in Boulder, Colorado years ago, and there was this woman there. And this woman, she had such an amazing aura, such an amazing energy about her. And she was this beautiful blonde-haired woman, and she had she was missing one of her arms from right about around the elbow. Yet here she is working as a server in a very crowded bar, carrying drinks on one hand, and just unbelievable confidence. She owned it. This could have been a limiting thing for her, and she said you could tell it was written all over her face that she made it work for her, not against her. And I realized in that moment, and it took a long time to really do that, but like to embrace that and just say, for example, I was born with really bad club feet. I've had surgery on my feet 8 or 9 times, and my legs are really skinny. They're very like when I walk down the street in shorts, people look at me, and sometimes kids will say, what's wrong with his feet or whatever. And I used to be very self-conscious about that, but now I own that because you know what? If I had been born 100 years earlier, I would never have walked. And so, shifting to that perspective of, I have a gift. I, got the best treatment that you can get, and now I can walk. And I was even a springboard diver in high school, even though I can't really point my toes. I was not going to win any big awards, but I had fun doing it, and I learned to own it. I learned to make it work for me, and that's really the key thing is, you can point to anything and make it your secret excuse, or you can make it work for you. And that's a choice. From all the coaching that I've done with people, I've seen over and over again, I'm not going to say that everybody has a secret excuse, but I'd be willing to bet you that a lot of people have a secret excuse. And the question is, what is it and what's it getting in the way of?
Rob, did you ever receive hypnotherapy or any other past life regression?
I did indeed. After reading some of Brian Weiss's books, like Many Lives, Many Masters, I was really intrigued by the whole idea of past lives. And I thought, I'm an experiencer. I like to try things and see what's out there. And so I called up Brian Weiss's office to get a referral in the Chicago area. And I went out to Hyde Park on the south side of Chicago and met with this doctor who hypnotized me. And I was wondering if I could actually even go under hypnosis, but I thought, let's give it a shot. So I did, and it was wild because he almost immediately, I found myself sitting in a wheelchair with like a white gown on, and I was in the middle of this, countryside, and there were other people around. And as we talked about it, he started asking me, where are you? What year was it? I think it was like 18 something. And then he asked, he said, bring me to the day of your death. I think that was how I ended up there, actually. And then we started looking at what were the lessons of that lifetime. And it was interesting because what had happened in that lifetime was apparently I had been diagnosed with tuberculosis or something like that. I don't know if they even had a name for it at the time. And I remember I was in the back of a horse-drawn carriage with two kids, and I was their mother. And one of the kids was my girlfriend, Amy, that she and I had broken up a few months before that. And I recognized her immediately from the big bright blue eyes that she had. And I just had this, really sad feeling that we never saw each other after that, because basically I'd been sent to like an insane asylum sort of thing. And that was when we, at the end of the regression, Dr. Huck was saying, he said, what you described was a mental institution from like the late 1800s. And it was interesting because a lot of times, some of the critics of past life, experiencers is everybody comes back and says they were Jesus or whatever. It's like, no, there's nothing aspirational about having a past life in a mental institution. But what was interesting about that was just the whole idea of, that what I walked away from that with was that there were people in that lifetime that I had connections with later, and that it reinforced the idea that we really do travel together. As an example, later on, one of the people that I met, I was in Arizona at the Titanic exhibit. And this woman who was dressed in period attire, she was working at the exhibit, came up to me and she said, "Sir, may I see your boarding pass?" And there was no one there that day. And so when I walked in, no one gave me, the boarding pass that I was supposed to get. And I looked at her and I said, "I'm sorry, I don't have one." And she said, "No problem." She smiled and she said, "I will go get one." And she hands me a boarding pass, and I'm not going to say who the person was, uh, but when I saw the movie Titanic, and I had read, I don't even know how many books in the Titanic before that even became a thing, I had always had this connection to it. And she gave me the boarding pass of the person that I felt the most connected to from the whole saga. And it was really wild because later, when I asked an intuitive friend of mine, I just said, what was my connection to the Titanic? I said, or what, if any, connection did I have to the Titanic? And she paused, and I've asked a number of people that, and they both come back with the same thing, which is that I was in fact on the ship, and I did go down with the ship, and I was one of the people who worked for the company that had built it. And it was wild because I have two friends in this lifetime who were also on the ship, from their past lives and regressions. In one case, the person did a regression, and she knows that she was one of the first class passengers. And the other one, same thing. She had a strong connection with the people there, and these are people that I do believe that we've had different lifetimes before. So there's a lot to that, and it's fun when you realize that we do get other chances, and we will come back, and we do have lots of experiences, and we travel with the same people. I think it's a beautiful thing when if you think about life as a play, or a playground, that we get the chance to do that is really a miracle in itself.
Have you ever gotten any validation from your past lives that they were or are real?
Absolutely. My favorite one was a friend of mine that I had met. We had taken a class together. I don't even remember. Oh, it was a class on the Akashic Records. And afterwards, she had offered to give me a reading. She didn't even charge me for it. And she started telling me that I had had a past life in the like 12th century as a Native American medicine man. And at the time, I was, reading Tom Brown Jr.'s books, and I was really into that thing. And she said, or I looked at her and I said, "What was my name?" And she looked at me and she said, "I'm getting that's not important." And I said, "Well, what tribe was I with?" And I'm thinking, oh, I hope it's, the Sioux or Lipan Apache, Dances with Wolves was out at that time. And so I was thinking about the Sioux tribe and all that stuff. She looked at me and she's like, "Chippewa." And I thought, Chippewa, that seems kind of boring and random, and I was a little disappointed in that moment. Well, the next day, I look up Chippewa online. I do a little Google search, and underneath it says the third entry under Google was the Chippewa of Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan. Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan is the town where I was born. I'm the only person in my family who was not born in Chicago, and that's extended family too. Um, and so it's this tiny little town in Upper Peninsula, Michigan. So that was kind of wild. And then I was telling my dad about it later because he's always been really open to this. And he looked at me and he said, "Yeah." And he said, "And you were born in Chippewa County," which I thought was really wild. And then the next day I'm at the gym, and this T-shirt gets my attention. This guy that I'd never seen at the gym before. And when I looked at it, it had this little design going across the top, but it wasn't the design. There was an Indian on horseback underneath. And on the shoulder of his shirt, it said Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan. And I thought, wow, three times in less than 24 hours after this reading, I got confirmation of the Sault Ste. Marie, Chippewa, what she had told me, which, like I said, frankly, I didn't even really want to believe it because I was so hopeful that it was, that I was a Lipan Apache, but apparently I wasn't.
Rob, after watching this podcast, people may want to reach out to you and ask you questions. Are you open to that?
Absolutely. Yeah, for sure. If you go to the website, atrekwithin.com, there's a contact form there. You can even download a free chapter of the book, either in audio form or the PDF. Uh, Take a look at it and see if it's something that's, resonates for you. But definitely reach out. I'm happy to answer questions.
Do you have anything else that you're working on that you want people to know about?
The big thing is just, right now is the book. There's going to be another book later on about, some of the experiences I've had around travel. There'll probably be a follow-up to this because so many people have begun to share some of their own miraculous stories and on their own journey. And so it's very likely that I'm going to do a follow-up to the book at some point. But for right now, I'm focusing on just, building that community and getting people to share and realize that we have more in common than we have, in the way of differences.
Do you have a YouTube channel?
I do indeed. If you, the YouTube channel is Rob Sullivan, and I have a podcast called A Trek Within, where I interview different people from the book. So I've interviewed a number of psychics. I've interviewed a reader of the book. Just a lot of different people who have different perspectives. So, some of the people who shared stories in the book. It's been really fun. I'm only, 12 podcasts into it, but it's something that I'm going to continue to do and to have lots of different people. I'm going to have musicians on there sharing, how inspiration shows up for them. So just very different exploration of spirituality. So it's not just, in any one direction, like psychics, for example, but, the many ways that spirit touches us, and it's all good if we're open to it.
Rob, before we finish up, can you leave us with one last positive message?
Absolutely. One of the things that people often ask is, how do you know if the person you're dealing with is the real deal? Or, for example, if you go to a psychic or an intuitive or a healer or whatever, how do you know that they are really capable of doing the things that they say they can? And to me, the real litmus test is, how do you feel after you've interacted with them? The people that I've interacted with who truly have spiritual gifts, when I leave their presence, I feel lighter. I feel like I gained something. I feel like there's an insight that was shared, and sometimes it expands over time, versus the ones where you walk away and say, oh, that didn't really feel right, or, trust your intuition. We've all had a gut instinct that we didn't follow and later wished we did. That's what they're there for. And so a big part of that, your inner journey should be listening to that voice within and trusting and asking yourself the question, how do I feel right now? Does this feel right? And if it doesn't feel right, don't go there.
Rob, thank you for your message, and thank you for being my guest.
Thank you. It's such a pleasure to meet you and to be on your show.
Likewise. Thanks for watching the JeffMara podcast. I really appreciate you. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. And if you do, there are loyalty badges and other perks depending on your level of membership. All you need to do is click the join button underneath the video to find out more. Thank you for your support.